In the mid-1960s, a series of brutal murders spread fear across the Dąbrowa Basin and Upper Silesia regions of Poland. The killer targeted women, leaving behind a trail of blood and horror that earned him the notorious nickname, the Vampire of Zagłębie. Despite the efforts of law enforcement and the Ministry of Defense, the killer remained elusive for years, terrorizing the nation. His reign of terror would ultimately span from 1964 to 1970, and his identity would shock the country. Zdzisław Marchwicki, a seemingly ordinary man, was revealed as the predator responsible for these horrific crimes. Zdzisław Marchwicki was born on October 8, 1927, in Dąbrowa Górnicza, a small industrial city in southern Poland. His upbringing was anything but stable. Raised in an impoverished and dysfunctional household, Marchwicki's father was a chronic alcoholic who married 5 times, leaving a trail of broken homes and fractured family life. After his mother's early death, Zdzisław and his siblings were left to fend for themselves. Marchwicki struggled academically and showed little aptitude or interest in school. By his teenage years, he had developed an alcohol problem similar to his father's and dropped out of school early. He took a job in the Zawarski iron mines and later married a woman named Maria. However, his personal life was far from stable. His marriage was tumultuous, marked by violence and disturbing behavior. Marchwicki himself wrote chilling accounts of his fascination with dead women, claiming that the sight of their exposed bodies and the smell of blood excited him. On November 7, 1964, the first known victim of the vampire was discovered. A 15-year-old girl was brutally murdered in the city of Katowice, her body beaten with a heavy object, her clothes disheveled, and her remains discarded in an isolated area. This was just the beginning of a string of similar murders that would haunt the region for years. The killings escalated quickly. In January 1965, another victim, Iwa Baka, was found murdered in Gliwice, followed by Lydia Nowaka in Bytom. The killer's modus operandi was consistent. He attacked women from behind, used a heavy object to strike, and dragged their bodies to secluded locations. Despite the similarities between the murders, law enforcement struggled to catch the elusive killer. As more women disappeared, fear gripped the region. Residents avoided the streets at night, and women were advised not to go out alone. Some rumors circulated that the killer was on a mission to murder 1,000 women, adding to the panic. By 1965, authorities had identified a pattern and created a special task force to capture the killer. Despite intense efforts and the involvement of Poland's Ministry of Defense, the vampire continued to claim victims. Over the next 2 years, the number of attacks grew, and the killer left behind a trail of death and chaos. Between 1964 and 1970, Marchwicki was responsible for 9 murders and 5 attempted murders. The turning point in the investigation came in 1970 when the body of Juliana Gierk, a politically connected young woman, was found in a river. Her death brought renewed urgency to the case. Investigators narrowed their focus to several suspects, including Zdzisław Marchwicki, who was arrested in 1972 after his wife reported him for domestic abuse. Once in custody, authorities began to link him to the unsolved murders. Marchwicki eventually confessed to the crimes, though his confession was far from clear. He often appeared confused about the number of victims and the specific details of the murders. Nonetheless, his admission of guilt was enough to bring him to trial. The trial, held in Katowice in 1974, attracted widespread attention. The court, which seated 800 spectators, was packed with people eager to see the man responsible for the nation's terror. Despite retracting his confession and proclaiming his innocence, the evidence against Marchwicki was overwhelming. Witnesses, including his wife, testified against him, and circumstantial evidence sealed his fate. Marchwicki's brothers, Henrik and Jan, were also implicated in the crimes. Jan was sentenced to death for his role in one of the murders, while Henrik received a 25-year prison sentence. Marchwicki himself was sentenced to death, and on April 26, 1977, he was executed by hanging. His final words, spoken in defiance, were, "I am innocent." In the years following his execution, doubts emerged about whether Marchwicki was truly the Vampire of Zagłębie. Some investigators later questioned whether the right man had been convicted, pointing to gaps in the evidence and inconsistencies in Marchwicki's confession. Journalist Grazina Starsga, who investigated the case in the 1990s, raised the possibility that Marchwicki may have been a scapegoat and that the true killer was never found. To this day, the case of Zdzisław Marchwicki remains one of the most infamous and controversial in Polish criminal history. Whether guilty or not, the story of the Vampire of Zagłębie continues to haunt the region, a chilling reminder of a dark chapter in the nation's past.